Americans and their idea of freedom, it's not freedom from hunger, it's not freedom from want, okay? And it's not even freedom to elect who you'd like to have in power, because you've got two choices, Republican or Democrat, you know? It's a bizarre notion of freedom that they have in America. What China wanted was freedom from want, freedom being forced from poverty to do things rather than having the freedom that a decent income gives you to live. And so that's the Chinese focus. Now, the Americans will continue pushing this freedom nonsense in one of the world's worst democratic systems on the planet. They'll continue pushing that. But if China doubles again in the next 8 years, which is unlikely, it might take them 15 years this time, then the gap between China and America is going to be so enormous that.
大家好，今天这期视频给大家带来的是最近引发争议的一场访谈。澳大利亚经济学教授史蒂夫·基恩与一位西方主持人围绕中国崛起、美国衰落以及中西方发展模式展开了一场激烈讨论。过去几十年，西方世界一直相信市场竞争、资本主义和所谓自由才是推动经济发展的关键。可如今，一个越来越难以回避的问题摆在面前：为什么同样面对全球化和技术革命，中国的发展路径却呈现出了完全不同的结果？中国为什么能够在短短几十年里让数亿人摆脱贫困？为什么高铁、电力、公共设施以及制造业能够形成如此庞大的规模？更值得关注的是，中国明明没有完全照搬西方模式，却同时拥有激烈的市场竞争和强大的国家规划能力。反过来看美国，曾经引领全球工业和科技发展的超级大国，如今却出现了产业空心化、金融过度扩张和基础设施老化等问题。那么，究竟是中国找到了另一条发展道路，还是美国正在走上曾经英国衰落的老路？如果未来中国与美国之间的差距继续扩大，西方过去那套关于自由、市场和发展的解释，还能解释现实吗？接下来，让我们一起走进这场访谈。
From my very superficial understanding, if we leave the political aspect aside, if that's even possible, the Chinese economy now isn't really all that different from ours, is it? There's insanely, like you mentioned, competitive markets. There's massive corporations. There's people who earn less, and there's people who earn billions and own all kinds of stuff. So where's the gap between the two?
The main gap is that the Chinese focus upon the public sphere. So they make sure the public facilities are good. There's a wonderful quote from John Kenneth Galbraith, one of my predecessors in a sense. And he just said, America is characterized by private affluence and public squalor. Okay. If you've been on the New York Underground, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, the public spaces are awful. Who gives a shit about the public? Let's get it all in private, that sort of thing. The Chinese thing, they wanted the best possible public spaces and public resources possible. And then in that space, the private sector can thrive. So you have the world's greatest, by far, high-speed rail network. They didn't develop the technology, but they did develop the network. You have health. Public health is cheaper, far cheaper than in China. I've had people coming back and telling me amazing stories about getting ill in China and being, cured for the equivalent of $10 at a hospital. Education is extremely hard to get into, but bloody high quality. So this means that you're not paying. In fact, you're being paid to be educated. But the thing is, you don't get that payment unless you do it very well in exams. So the whole thing is focusing upon raising skill levels. All this stuff means that the public sector in China is far stronger. And of course, there are state enterprises. State enterprises still account for about half the economy. So there's much more of a melding of the public and the private in a sensible sense, rather than what bloody Trump is doing to America right now. But a very good blend of public and private, and an emphasis upon providing the public facilities that enable the private sector to flourish. And that's China just has enormous advantages, even in terms of electric transmission. They use higher voltage systems for transmitting power. They're now looking at direct current. All these things America's talking about doing, but they're still stuck with lower voltage and alternating current systems. So the level of innovation of the public sphere in China is far, far higher than in America. And that then means the private sector is sort of standing on a higher plateau than is possible in America.
China has billionaires and lots of them, just like the US, right? I'm not a big fan of anyone having that kind of money, I have to say. However, unlike in the West, where the oligarchs are literally sitting at the president's table dictating policy to the rest of us, in China, they aren't letting these people run amok. Like we saw with Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, their political power is curbed by the party. They can make their money, but that's where it stops. Is that one of the key reasons for its success as well, do you reckon?
I think so. I mean, this is one thing. Xi has been criticized all the time as a new Mao. I've seen plenty of that. But friends of mine who live in China, both the Chinese and foreigners, tell me that what he was really doing is cleaning up some extent cleaning up the mess left after the recovery from the global financial crisis. So, the huge real estate bubble that had to be tamed, large investments that are going to fail that had to be covered. So he's been reversing some of certainly the pollution levels have fallen dramatically as well. So all these things require controls, okay? And therefore Xi is being put across as being another Mao. But it seems that the whole focus was on improving the physical facilities for the country. And he said that if you want to be rich, become a capitalist. If you want to be becoming a public servant, don't expect to make money. And there's an extremely strong anti-corruption drive in China, and people get executed for corruption. It's still a very brutal regime in that sense. What it means is, and actually one thing, when I was in China at this conference, we had a whole bunch of young students of journalism watching the conference between these sets of journalists that I'd put together. And they asked me about the ombudsman system in Australia. Now, the ombudsman system was borrowed from the Swedes, and that was an idea where there was a state authority making sure that state officials lived up to the objectives they were given. And this seems to be what China's managed to build as well. I didn't give the students the information. It's one of my failings, but this seems to be what China's done. So any public servant has effectively a performance sheet they have to live up to, and if they don't live up to it, then they don't get promoted. So what you get, consequently, this selection city system inside the public service there requires you to perform, to set objectives, and rewards those who do and blocks those who don't. There is a certain amount of nepotism. I'm not going to say there isn't in a system like that. But what it means is, however, whatever you think about the politics of the people who get to the top, they've shown they can perform. And this means that there's a way of monitoring the behavior and performance of the public sector that Americans think can only be done by the private sector and the profit motive. So instead, they've managed to get, in some ways, a well-disciplined, effective bureaucracy that realizes it has to satisfy the people under its control, so it can't just ignore them as Americans do in public health. And they let rampant competition occur at the same time in the private sector.
When debating China in the West, one fact that's always conveniently omitted is that China managed to lift, 500 million to 800 million out of abject poverty in just a couple of short decades. I had another economist on the show last year, Branko Milanovic, and he said, this is probably the biggest economic miracle in the history of our planet. How the hell did they do that?
Well, that's a very good point. When I was there again, we'd go to, this is in the 80s, 45 years ago, and we went to Sichuan, and there were people selling alligator skins on the main street. I mean, it was totally a sort of peasant society at the time. People criticized me for saying, but it's true. The majority of people were peasants, people who worked the land. Now you've got the majority being industrial workers, and it's an enormous country. So something like 800 million people have been raised out of abject poverty, and the rate of economic growth has been astonishing. The average over the last 40 years, the average rate of growth of per capita incomes has been about 8%. In China. Now, there's a little rule called the rule of 72. You divide your rate of growth into 72, and that tells you how long it takes you to double economic activity. So that basically gives you 8.5 years, 8 or 9 years. Doubling living standards every 8 or 9 years. America's rate of growth is per capita improvement's been about 2%. That means it takes 35 years, roughly, to double living standards. So one country's doubling 8 times every 8 years, the other's doubling every 35. no prizes for guessing which one gets there faster. So China's managed to do that, and it's really got an enormous level of capital formation. This is the difference between it and the West. Again, they're focused upon building up the machinery, the means of production, but they've also meant that happens both in the industrial goods sector and the consumer goods sector, which, unlike the Russians who just managed it in the industrial goods sector, and innovation. They want their products to be competitive, not just locally, but also globally. So you've got this huge export surplus they make, which they then reinvest in innovation. The government is running a deficit of up to 10% of GDP. Looking at Bank of International Settlements figures, that means that's another 10% of GDP going pretty much into physical investment. And their banks are private. Their banks are privately operated but publicly owned, fundamentally. So the banks are told they've got to provide working capital for corporations. So there's no shortage of money for investment in China, whereas there is a shortage of money for investment in America. You can get money for speculation. You want to gamble on house prices, sure, here's a mortgage. Okay? But in terms of working capital for companies, get out of here. So all the financial engines in China are directed towards capital formation and innovation. And most of the financial pressures in America are directed towards speculation on asset prices.
Since you mentioned that during your visit to China in 1981, they told you how they want to prop up their engineering sector. Have you perhaps read Dan Wang's book, Breakneck?
No, I haven't. No.
Okay. He argues that China is essentially run by engineers, as most of the Politburo is made up of engineers, including Xi Jinping, while the vast majority of the American presidents are lawyers, except Trump, obviously. So while China
he's a non-lawyer.
I don't know what he is, but definitely not a lawyer. Yeah. So while China kind of thrives when it comes to huge infrastructure projects and the development of technology, they often tumble when it comes to their sort of social engineering experiments. He says that, and vice versa for America. What do you think of this idea?
Well, I think the social experiments are pretty good as well, actually. They tend to be capitalizing on the history of China. So, like the last time I was in China was 2017. I desperately want to go back, but I haven't had the opportunity yet. And I saw, we were in north of North Korea, so one of the very northern provinces. And when you go walking around a Chinese city, there are people line dancing. Is a huge public activity. So this is something which comes out of the not just the communist days. It goes right back to Confucianism and Taoism and Tai Chi and all these sorts of things. So I saw a woman there who was line dancing, and she must have been 70. And I thought, you were raised during the Mao period, okay? And you would have seen all the privations that applied there. Even possible she was born before World War II, so she would have seen the horrors of the collapse of the Chinese system. And here she is line dancing with a whole bunch of people in an open park and thoroughly enjoying herself. And it's an enormous transition. So the Chinese have managed to hang on to those traditional elements of their culture. And like if you go shopping with a Chinese girlfriend, which I have done, the whole idea that they don't spend is nonsense. So they do have a large amount of social innovation. And it's more consistent with their culture, and their culture was cooperative.
I was watching some of your recent debates on China with Patrick Bat David, admiring your saintly patience, and also with that awful, pardon my language, toad Kevin O'Leary.
Oh, God Almighty, yeah.
But some of these fellas really make my skin crawl. And when you said that in the U.S., when you're walking around any major city, you're literally tripping over a homeless person every 5 seconds, while China covers their country in speed rail and EVs and futuristic infrastructure. All Kevin O'Leary could say to you was, but I don't want my children to be raised as Chinese communists or something along those lines. Is this refusal to acknowledge China's rise coming to an end, even amongst these types of
I think
cheerleaders?
I think the scale of change in China is becoming so overwhelming that they just can't continue repeating the same, trite lines about freedom. I mean, Americans and their idea of freedom, it's not freedom from hunger, it's not freedom from want, okay? And it's not even freedom to elect who you'd like to have in power, because you've got two choices, Republican or Democrat. It's a bizarre notion of freedom that they have in America. What China wanted was freedom from want, freedom being forced from poverty to do things rather than having the freedom that a decent income gives you to live. And so that's the Chinese focus. Now, the Americans will continue pushing this freedom nonsense in one of the world's worst democratic systems on the planet. They'll continue pushing that. But if China doubles again in the next 8 years, which is unlikely, it might take them 15 years this time, then the gap between China and America is going to be so enormous that, forget your talking points. You can't continue with that line anymore. And I think because of the engineering focus that China has, and because they're trying to be self-sufficient, in my opinion, they're likely to come through the next 10 years far better than the rest of the world. So yeah, the American copium over freedom is going to run out of mileage sometime in the next decade.
You think the rise of this sort of more progressive left, like Mamdani, and now we've seen with these local elections, they are having a lot of success within the Democratic Party. Do you think there's this kind of very vehement anti-Trump direction that the country might go in? We don't know if that's going to happen. Might alleviate some of these predictions for the U.S.
It's really hard to turn out where America's got to, because there's a database called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which is maintained by Harvard University computer scientists, and that has worked out a way of looking at how complex different societies are, the complexity of the goods they can produce. America's gone from about number 8 to number 20 over the last 25 years. China's gone from number 20 to number 8 at the same time period. And in fact, if you go back further, of course, China's come from virtually nowhere to up in the top 10 in terms of the complexity of products it can produce in its economy. That means you've got to have lots of engineers and skilled workers who can handle machine tools and design them in the first place. And America doesn't have the capability anymore. It's got a there's a wonderful clip with what's his name, Cook, the guy who was head of Apple, saying at a meeting in China that if you wanted to have a meeting with all the machine tool experts in America, he could hold it inside the auditorium he was in. If you wanted to have a meeting with all those experts in China, you'd need to have at least a couple of football stadiums. So America doesn't have the skill basis. It doesn't have the education system to train as many engineers as it needs as rapidly as is necessary. So I can't see America making up until it's realized it's been going the wrong way for the last 40 years, and that wrong way is letting the finance sector rule everything. So with the finance sector, they want more borrowed money, privately borrowed money. They want more speculation on non-financial assets, houses and shares. And that's the sort of world you get. You get financial engineers, not real engineers. Until America realized that was a mistake, then I think it's going to continue losing.
Like I said at the beginning, you called the 2008 financial crisis years before it happened. What's your prediction for the sort of short or medium-term economic relations between China and the West?
Oh, China's going to continue. I really believe, I don't know, but I think one of China's main objectives is to become as self-sufficient as possible, because that's how they were before they were raped by the Americans and the British during the Opium Wars in the 19th century. I'm sure most Americans think the Opium Wars were fought by America to keep Chinese drugs out of America. Okay? In fact, of course, it's the opposite. The Opium Wars were fought to let Europeans sell drugs to China because there's nothing else they could get Chinese people to buy out of the West. Now, that destroyed their industries, destroyed their culture. And of course, that's something every school kid learns in China. Okay?
The century of humiliation. It's
as ubiquitous as in China learning about that as is for Americans learning about the War of Independence, okay, and the Civil War. So they know they can't trust the West. And what the West is doing at the moment, America's ridiculous war in Persia,
Iran,
is making it even more obvious you can't trust them. So I'm sure underlying principle of the various plans is to become completely self-sufficient. Now that means that they can forget about the West, okay, which is what they did beforehand, and the West won't be very happy about that. But I think that's what I expect to happen. And equally, given the technological lead they've got in so many industries now, there's really no way that American companies can catch up without a devaluation. So I simply can't see American cars of similar quality to Japanese cars are about twice as expensive. That means you need a 50% devaluation before you restore price parity. Okay, and I think that's a likely outcome. So American dollar devaluing against the Chinese yuan, China continuing to try to become self-sufficient, but also dominating trade at the same time because that's a source of extra revenue for them, and a larger market and more capacity to innovate. And America, I think, is going to go on the same long, slow decline that England has been in.
You said that China wants to be self-sufficient, and if push comes to shove, it can just forget about the West. But we live in a more and more globalized world, and we share a lot of collective problems on a planetary basis now, such as the climate change or AI. So can China really afford to just step aside as these problems become more and more severe in the upcoming decades?
Well, I think they can insulate themselves from some of the damages. Okay. So, like, for example, one thing China has been doing is incredible rolling out of
renewables,
and also nuclear. And their nuclear plants are 1/5 the cost of the nuclear plants in the West, so they can do it much more rapidly, much more cheaply. So they're rapidly giving themselves independence from fossil fuels, for example, okay, as a result of that. So that's the sort of independence they want. At the same time, that's leading the international, because everybody else is talking about moving away from fossil fuels. China's actually doing it. And I think their objective by the end of the following the next 5-year plan, which I think starts in 2030, their objective by 2035 is to be pretty much off fossil fuels. Now, I could be wrong about the timing there, but certainly 2050 they intend being pretty much free of fossil fuels. Now that means they're leading the rest of the world. The rest of the world's talking about it, not doing it. China's actually doing it.
Since I'm from Europe originally, although I don't live there anymore, I'd be remiss not to ask you about the position of this old damsel of ours, not doing too well also. Apparently, the trade deficit is now $1 billion a day in China's favor. Europe just cannot compete with technologies that matter the most. Green tech, like you mentioned, EVs, AI, you name it.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, the German car industry, sort of like the backbone of the European economy, is on the verge of total collapse. Volkswagen just announced it will slash 100,000 jobs pretty soon, also because it cannot compete with cheaper, better Chinese cars. Is it in China's long-term interest to dominate Europe that hard?
Well, it's not in Europe's interest to be dominated that much, that's for sure.
That part I can understand, yeah.
Yeah, they really have lost the plot. I mean, the Maastricht Treaty, which is that's the main government policy in Europe, is to stop government spending. Okay, the Maastricht Treaty was called the Growth and Stability Pact. It's actually been the Stagnation and Instability Pact in terms of its impact. Okay, so the whole idea of the European Union was to create something like America or China in Europe, to have a single market over the whole European continent. Okay. And that's more difficult in Europe's case because you have more mountain ranges getting in the way. But fundamentally, yes, you've got an area of land similar to America, so you could have a market the same size as America. So that was the basic idea. But they removed some of the techniques that enable different countries to maintain decent relations with each other by creating the euro. So in the case of Italy, for example, Italy's always had a higher rate of inflation than Germany. That means over time, Italian vehicles get more expensive than German vehicles, which means that the Italians start buying German cars rather than Italian cars. Italian industry suffers, and so on. So that itself, that's hampered the capacity of Europe to compete rather than improving it by creating the euro. And then the limits on government spending mean that when there's an economic downturn, the government's required to cut its spending. That makes the downturn worse. So there are so many own goals by the Europeans. The thing they've got in their favor is they still have a damn good education system. Most of their education is free, covered by the state, but of course, therefore, you've got to do well to get in. So they've got some capacity to turn themselves around in an engineering sense. But the advantage that China's got over German car manufacturing and technology in general is scary. And again, I think the only way they can compete is to admit they've lost and devalue their currency.
回顾这场访谈，会发现表面上讨论的是中国为什么崛起，美国为什么陷入困境，但更深层的问题其实是一个国家究竟应该采用什么样的发展模式，才能让经济增长 真正转化为普通人的生活改善。基恩教授从美国的霸权崛起讲起。二战之后，美国凭借庞大的工业体系、巨大的国内市场以及特殊的国际金融地位，迅速成为全球经济中心。但几十年过去，曾经强大的美国却逐渐出现了去工业化、金融化、基础设施老化等问题。与此同时，中国却在不断扩大制造业规模，完善基础设施，并形成了强大的工程和产业能力。最值得思考的地方恰恰在这里，为什么中国没有完全照搬西方模式，却能够同时拥有激烈的市场竞争和强大的国家规划能力？为什么美国拥有全球最成熟的金融体系，却越来越难以维持过去那种工业竞争力？访谈中，基恩教授尤其强调了中国模式的一个特点：国家负责建设铁路、电力、教育、公共卫生等基础设施，为市场创造条件，私人企业之间则保持激烈竞争，通过竞争推动创新。也正是在这种结合之下，中国完成了大规模工业化，并让数亿人口摆脱贫困。而与此同时，美国和欧洲却面临另一个问题：如果金融资本不断壮大，却没有带来相应的实体产业和公共服务改善，那么这种经济增长究竟意味着什么？更加值得讨论的是，当中国的制造业、工程技术和产业链优势不断扩大，西方过去那套关于发展、市场和自由的逻辑，还能不能解释今天的现实？而这场访谈最有争议的地方，也恰恰在这里。一个国家真正需要的自由，究竟是选择谁执政的自由，还是摆脱贫困、获得教育、医疗和体面生活的自由？经济发展的最终目标，到底应该是资本不断增值，还是让普通人真正过得更好？如果未来中国继续扩大与美国的产业和工程优势，中美之间的差距会走向什么方向？美国能够重新夺回制造业竞争力吗？你认为中国的发展模式究竟是暂时的特殊现象，还是正在形成一种能够与西方模式长期竞争的另一条道路？欢迎把你的观点留在评论区。